All right, so we're going to be talking about the CTQ, or critical to quality tree, today. It's really a great tool, and Compass does a great job of creating this tool for you. It's very user friendly, but I'm going to start by kind of defining both critical to quality, the concept, and voice of the customer, which are both really key concepts to understanding how and when to use this tool. So we're going to start with that. Then we'll get into some details on what the CTQ tree is, how it should be used, and we'll walk through an example using the Compass tool, which you will be able to receive after this program. So we're going to walk through that. And then after we walk through actually using the tool, we're going to use what's called Kano analysis to categorize and prioritize the customer requirements that come out of this tool. So I'm going to show you how to do that, and then we'll talk about what the next steps are after that. So let's start with with the voice of the customer, or VOC. This is a very commonly used Six Sigma term, which has expanded well beyond Six Sigma. What do we mean by the voice of the customer? Well, it's really understanding whether our customer is internal or external, what their expectations, preferences are, and even aversions are. So we need to talk to our customer. How do we do that? We'll talk a little bit about how to do that. It's really about market research, particularly if it's an external customer, but to really understand what the customer wants and needs are. And then we can take that, as we'll talk about later on in the program, and organize and prioritize those needs, so that when we redesign or design our process or product, we'll be able to ensure that we meet these requirements. And these requirements, as you'll see, should also be measurable, so that we can be sure and certain that we've actually met these requirements. So that's, at a high level, what the voice of the customer represents. Now, in order to be successful at capturing and utilizing the voice of the customer, we want to use this critical to quality concept, CTQ, and we need to do some research in order to do that. So first of all, we need to understand who our customer or customers are. Are they internal, external? We need to define and understand who the customers are. Secondly, we need to gather their needs, and that's what this program is going to be about. How do we understand what the customer needs are and what their requirements are? And ultimately, we want those to be measurable. So we're going to generate metrics so that we can evaluate our performance versus the customer requirements. And then we're going to be able to take those requirements and transition those into specific process or product design features. So that's, at a high level, what critical to quality is. So we need to learn what's important to the customers. How do we do that? It somewhat depends on whether we're dealing with internal or external customers, but things like surveying the customer base, looking at letters that are coming in, particularly things like complaints, published reviews, and other customer communications, demands from the customer. We want to really understand what our customer is saying. And in a lot of businesses, we're already capturing this information, and we may be responding to the customer, but now what we want to do is kind of analyze what the customer is saying and utilize it to our advantage, so we can actually create products and processes that meet these customer requirements. All of that input, surveys, complaints, emails, reviews, all these things that we're getting from the customer are, in a sense, the voice of the customer. That's what the customer is telling us. But now we want to take that information and actually translate it to customer requirements. So before we get into the CTQ tool and how to use it, I want to say a few things about what customer requirements are all about. When we're creating a customer requirement statement, we want to make sure it links to a specific output or moment of truth with the customer. So we'll use some examples later on of what these outputs might be. We want them to describe a single performance criterion that we can then measure. So they must be measurable or observable. And then we want to be able to know whether we've met this requirement. So there needs to be a way for us to say acceptable or unacceptable when it comes to our performance. We want to be able to understand that. And then obviously these things must be validated by what the customer's saying. And if we use this process, they certainly will be. So when would we use this tool? When would we use a CTQ tree? Well, initially when we're defining our problem and our customer requirements in the early stage of a project, maybe it's a DMAIC project, maybe it's a design project for a brand new service, process, or product, we want to understand at that point what the customer requirements are so that later on in the process, we can really design according to these customer requirements. So it's going to be used early on, but then later at the end, we'll talk about how we're going to revisit these things and actually use them in an ongoing way at the end. But the CTQ tool and tree should be used early on. So how do we use it? Well, we want to start gathering that input. So we may already have survey data, we may have complaints, we may have all of these things that we talked about, but we want to prioritize these things in terms of the customer feedback. And sometimes that's difficult because the feedback may be worded in such a way that we need to do a little analysis to combine and sort similar feedback into a single issue. So once we've gotten all of this information, we want to sift through it and try to combine it into similar feedback. So for example, we may have gotten lots of different ways from the customer of saying faster resolution of problems is what they want. As an example, we may have gotten different phrases and different sentences and requests from the customer, but we want to combine that into one. So for example, faster resolution of problems turns out to be our top issue in this example. And this, by the way, this would be an example from a call center, and you can think of it as a satellite or even cable company that's kind of analyzing their call center. So their customer issue is faster resolution of problems, complaints about having to make multiple calls, and then too long on hold are the three top ones. And then there's some other issues that make up 11 additional issues. So these are just input that we receive from the customer, and we've kind of combined them into single issues, okay? Then what we can do is a very simple Pareto chart to rank these items and kind of figure out where are the top issues. Well, in this case, it's fairly straightforward. We really only have three key issues, and the top two there, faster resolution of problems and having to make multiple calls, makes up more than 70% of all of the inputs we receive from the customer. So this is a fairly simple example. So we take those two issues and we're gonna focus primarily on these two issues to then create our CTQ chart and identify specific requirements, measurable requirements around these two issues, okay? So first of all, let's talk about the Compass CTQ tree. This is a very simple Excel file that you're gonna open, and it's going to look like this. It's got multiple trees on it or multiple needs that you can actually analyze, but you would double click the first one as we see here, and it's going to look like this. So in here, in this actual tree, you're going to start with the need, and we'll look at that. We're going to look at the one example that we were just talking about. Then we're going to type in the outputs associated with that need. And then for each output, we're going to identify requirements or a single requirement if there's not more than one, which become our measurable requirements and CTQs. So let's kind of start with faster resolution of problems. So we're going to start there and say, okay, we've got faster resolution of problems as our need. What are the outputs, the points at which we actually interface with the customer, the actual moments of truth, if you will, the outputs that are related to this? Well, we have the delivery of an item. So for example, you call into your satellite service or cable service, and you need a repair part or a new, a new device of some sort. So timely item delivery is one output. Another output might be timely appointment scheduling. So actually setting up an appointment. And then another output might be the repair itself, a successful repair. So these are the outputs. Now, associated with these outputs, now what we want to do is identify what are some measurable requirements that tie back to these outputs. Because if we just left it as timely, for example, what does timely mean? We don't want to do that. We want to get into some more detail. So in order to do that, we need to understand what an appropriate requirement statement is. So I have some examples here of vague or poorly written requirements versus more specific, acceptable requirement statements that we can actually verify and validate whether we meet those. So if we start with treat customers like family, let's suppose this is an example. We're running a restaurant and we say, okay, our goal is to treat customers like family, or our requirement is that. That's fine as a mission or something like that, but it's not measurable. So one example of how to do that might be greet patrons within 30 seconds of entry into the restaurant. That we can actually measure. We can audit that. We can check on that. Another one might be easy to fill out form. That's certainly something that we want, but it's not really something that we can measure, right? So instead, we might say, form must take no more than 5 minutes on average to complete, and we can measure that, right? Another one might be easy to assemble furniture. All chairs must be able to be assembled by any adult in 15 minutes using a maximum of 3 tools. That's a design that we can actually validate at the end and say, yeah, we're able to meet that requirement. Finally, we've got 2 more. Fast delivery sounds good, but what's fast, right? Product delivered within 24 hours of customer order. And then we have short wait time on hold. And we might say waiting time must not exceed 60 seconds. And we can start measuring that. What percentage of the time are they waiting longer than 60 seconds? So with that in mind, these types of requirements are what we're looking for, something that's measurable.
Hey,
Okay.
hey, Darren.
Yeah.
I just can't resist but recognizing that IKEA would fail miserably on the specification for furniture assembly, and I don't think I'd get any argument about that. A question
True.
came up from the panel, or from our audience. Where in the DMAIC process would the CTQ activity fit best?
It would fit, I like to say it would fit in the define phase, and it can also be part of a measure phase as well. If we're talking about a DMAIC process, I like to start this very early on because we define the problem, and then what we want to do is also define what are the customer requirements at that point for this process. Now, if it's a new process or new product, it would also be early on in the process because we want to gather that input from the customer and understand what our requirements are early on, because it may also help us in terms of what to measure in that next phase as well. So to me, it's really part of the define phase of the project. But then we use it again later on for validating these requirements as well, and verifying and maybe putting in place ongoing metrics. So we'll talk about that later. But yeah, it's early on in the process. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these requirements based on these outputs. So we're going to say timely item delivery. That's something the customer wants. It's an output. The delivery itself is the output. So we might say emergency parts delivered within 24 hours. Okay, that we can measure. So we'll know whether or not those emergency parts are being delivered within 24 hours. And later on, as you'll see, we can check our current performance against that. But at this point, we wouldn't. Another one is the correct part delivered? So what percentage of the time do we actually have the correct part? For timely appointment scheduling, right? That again sounds good, but what do we want out of that? So you might come up with a rule that says we want appointments scheduled within 48 hours of the call, okay, as a reasonable goal, and we can measure against that. Successful repair, okay, definitely we want that, but what is it that defines a successful repair? Well, 100% first-time resolution. In other words, the tech does not have to come back, right? They come out, they make the repair, and you're satisfied with it. How often do you actually have to call them back? And you all have experienced something like that. But our goal would be 100% first-time resolution. And then timeliness for the tech arriving within 5 minutes of appointment time is also part of a successful repair, because as you all know, if you make an appointment, you want to make sure that that person is showing up within a reasonable time frame around that appointment time, and that, to me, that's part of a successful repair as well. So these are some examples of requirements. Now, what you would do, that's that first one, fast resolution of problems, right? We may have other needs, and what you would do is repeat this exercise. So you would go in and double click where it says type your need here for the second one, and as many as you're actually going to create. If you need more than 4, you can add more. You can copy additional ones in there. If you need fewer, you can actually delete them. And similarly with these outputs and requirements, the blank ones, if you want to delete those, you can. So it's very flexible, very user-friendly. And one other thing I wanted to mention about the tool while we have the whole thing up is that once you receive this and start using it, you can certainly use, your experience through this webinar to help you create it. But what's really neat about this is it has video instructions that you can click, and that just has a very short couple of minute walkthrough of the tool, so you don't miss anything in terms of the mechanics of how to use it. But it is very, very user-friendly. All right, so let's talk about prioritizing requirements. Once you've identified these requirements, now what we want to do is prioritize these. So a good way of prioritizing requirements is using what's called Kano analysis. Kano analysis was created by a gentleman named Kano, Noriyuki Kano. I'm probably not pronouncing his name correctly, but he came up with this structure where we can look at 3 categories where we can take our customer requirements and features and put those into these categories. So the first category at the top is what we call basic needs, and they are dissatisfiers if they're not present. Okay, so these are features in a process or a product that are taken for granted unless they're absent. Okay, so if it's something that's a must-have within a product. So for example, if we were talking about a smartphone today, a must-have in a smartphone would be internet access, right? That's a given. You're not gonna buy one that does not have that. So it's a must-have within the product. So basic requirements that customers, they're not even going to think about or mention those because they're going to assume that that's going to be part of the product or process. Okay, performance needs. We like to think of those as more of these are better. They're nice to haves that the customer might be willing to pay more for. So a faster service, lower cost, a more of a certain feature. For example, again, if we take an iPhone as an example, or whatever Android device you might use, a higher resolution camera might be a performance need. Okay, it's definitely something the customer is aware of, but more of it would be better. Okay, and then we have delighters. Those are things that are probably not going to come out of surveys and things like that from the customer, because they're generally not going to be mentioned at all. The customer isn't even aware that they exist yet. They're difficult to discover, and they're usually developed at the company in terms of R&D and marketing, and people that are thinking about what's the next big thing that we can add to this process or product. So these are called delighters, and they're something that eventually become performance needs and maybe even basic needs down the road. And again, going back to a phone or a smartphone device, you might think of initially the talk, where you can actually talk to it, Siri or whatever device you use. That was a delighter at one point. We weren't aware of that, but now that's probably more of a performance need or even a basic need on a smartphone. So you could see how these kind of things, they kind of evolve. But when we initially do our analysis, we want to capture these things. So how can we use our requirements in using Kano analysis? Okay, so for this example, what we could do is, oops, I'm sorry, I keep clicking the wrong thing. What we could do here is look at each output, look at the requirement, and then think about, is it a must-have? Is it a performance need? A more is better? It's probably not a delighter. That's something we would add later. And then we can evaluate our current performance. And that's really important because once we identify these customer requirements, we want to know how well are we meeting these customer requirements. So we might start with emergency parts delivered within 24 hours of call as a requirement. Okay, now is that a must-have for the customer? Is it a performance need, a more is better, or is it a delighter? We might say, and you can argue and debate this, we might say more is better. If it's within 24 hours, that's a more is better thing, because that would be great. But the customer is certainly aware of it, so it's not a delighter. And right now we might have 85% of our cases where it is being delivered or not. You would want to measure that performance. So now we might say, okay, correct part delivered. That's a must-have. Okay, delivering the wrong part is a major dissatisfier for the customer. So has the correct repair part been delivered? And we're saying 95% of the time. And that may sound okay, but it's pretty egregious that 5% of the time we're actually sending out the wrong part. So that's a problem we want to work on. Appointment scheduling. We would say, okay, appointment scheduled within 48 hours. We said that is a must-have. The customer, when you call your satellite or cable company, you expect an appointment to be had with no more than 48 hours. So how well are we doing on that? Well, not so well, 60% of the time. Successful repair. We're saying 100% first-time resolution. That's a more is better. You might argue that's a must be because customers really are dissatisfied when it's not resolved the first time. But we're only 80% on that over the past 6 months. Again, that's a problem. And then we could say tech arrives within 5 minutes of appointment time. That's a more is better. Again, you might argue that's a must be as well, but we're not even measuring that. So we don't know how well we're doing at this point. And then finally, on hold less than 60 seconds for our waiting time issue, that would be a more is better issue as well, but 50% of the time, it's more than 60 seconds. So that is not a good thing for our customer.
Hey, Darren.
Yes.
Thanks for reminding me how dissatisfied I am with just about everything.
Well, that's what, this is good for the team to kind of evaluate. They may be thinking we're doing a great job, but once they start measuring against their actual customer requirements and not treating these complaints as just things we have to deal with and respond to the customer, really we want to think about how well are we performing. And when you look at this, you start realizing, well, maybe we're not performing that well. There's some opportunity here, and we can become more competitive. We can grow our customer base, we can grow our revenue. So it's not all, a lot of times when we think about Six Sigma, it's all, and lean even, we just think about cost reduction and things like that. Whereas with something like this, we also may have an opportunity to grow the business, to actually grow revenue on that side, as opposed to just reducing costs. So these are some opportunities where if we're not performing too well, we can redesign and actually perform much better. So that's a good point. Good point. All right, so first of all, let me just say what you would do once you have this Kano analysis complete. what would we do with all of this? Well, first thing is, in my example there, we had current performance for a lot of these things, but you may find that you don't have that. You've developed these requirements, but you're not even measuring against them yet. So that's where we want to start measuring our current performance. And that's where, like I mentioned, if you're doing this in the define phase, once you're going into the measure phase, there may be some key metrics here that you want to start measuring so we can see how our performance compares to what we would like and what the customer would like. Then as you go through the process of developing or improving your process or your product, if we're dealing with that, we want to make sure that these requirements become features of our product or process. And then we're going to verify that later on by including these things as criteria for our solution. So when we're developing our solution or our final design, we want to make sure these things are part of the criteria, and then we can measure against that and then validate, yes, we are actually meeting these requirements. And then later on in our control phase, we may have several of these metrics as ongoing metrics that we're going to continue tracking. For example, 100% on-time resolution, first-time resolution, I should say. That's something we should be continually measuring if we're in this business. So we want to know how well are we resolving these issues. Same thing with, on-time delivery of parts. Again, that's something we can measure on an ongoing basis. So these things that we develop early on, these requirements we're developing early on in the process, should actually become ongoing measurements in many cases. So it's really throughout the whole DMAIC process, if that's what we're using, that we're going to be using these requirements, but they should be developed early on. Are there any other questions I can answer? Ian, any questions come up?
Yeah, there are
Okay.
a couple. First of all, the one that we get on every Tool of the Month session so far is, and I'll just answer it for everybody here, is can I get a copy of your slide deck? So we get that every time, and the answer is sure. Happy to do that. You'll in your survey that you receive from us, you can respond to that and let us know that you'd like to receive the deck. We don't send that out automatically, but we do send it out on request. The second question for you, Darren, from a member of our audience is, I often use a stakeholder analysis. It seems the CTQ tree is much more specific. Would it make sense to substitute the CTQ for the stakeholder analysis for that target audience?
Okay, good question. They are somewhat related, but I would not substitute it. Let me talk a little bit about how I would use stakeholder analysis. So early on, I would definitely use that also in the define very early on when we're defining the project. We would want to identify who our stakeholders are. And stakeholders, for those of you that may not have a good definition of this, are people that are affected by the project or can influence the project. And they certainly do include customers, but they may also include influencers within the company, managers that may influence employees that may be affected by the changes you're making. So I would say the stakeholder analysis is more broad, and the goal of that initially early on is to identify how exactly we plan to communicate with and deal with each stakeholder. So for example, if there's a key individual within the company that may not be a customer of it, but they may influence the project, I would want to know as a team, how are we going to communicate with and deal with this individual? We may want to keep him or her informed of what we're doing every step of the way so that we don't run into problems when we start developing and trying to implement solutions. So that's an example where stakeholder analysis might be, in that case, unrelated, but where it is related is that we're going to identify customers as well as stakeholders and identify how to work with and strategize our dealings with the customer. But usually out of stakeholder analysis, we don't refine the requirements. So I think you kind of need both. Mm-hmm. Stakeholder analysis might be done earlier on, even before we do this, because we want to identify the customer, identify how we deal with each stakeholder, but then this is going to be used to really refine and identify the requirements from the customer.
All right, we have another
Does that
question,
make
if you don't
sense?
mind. Yes,
Okay,
thank
sure.
you. I thought it made sense. Where would you incorporate the house of quality in this process?
Well, House of Quality is another tool for measuring those features, right? So again, with the House of Quality, you start with what the requirements are and how to measure them. But I think House of Quality, the way I use that is more for, and I know people use it for process as well, but I use that more for product, where we're looking at these actual features and then measurements. And I would say that's a little more advanced and more even detailed and specific than this is. So I would use that after I did this, or even in some cases, you could argue that you can actually substitute, the entire process of QFD House of Quality for this. But I would say this is probably generally more useful because you can use it for a lot of things. It doesn't really, for any project where we identify the customer, whether internal or external, I think it's worthwhile going through and defining what those customer requirements are. But when we get into product features and a lot of detail, I think the QFD House of Quality is probably more useful
Hmm.
at that point.
Definitely more detailed and, maybe the
Yeah.
subject of a future tool of the month club.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. It's a great tool. It is a
another,
great tool.
more questions are coming in now. Just one at the moment. Quality is one aspect. What are some other categories that we should look to for getting the voice of quality, voice of the customer? I'm not sure that you didn't cover that early on, but maybe you can tackle it again.
Well, I think well, let me think about that. So when we say quality, when we're getting input from the customer, right, through surveys and all of these things, it's going to be things that you might not consider to be quality in terms of, defects and things like that. Um, but it's really all aspects of performance. So I'm trying to understand and think about the question, is on-time delivery quality? Is faster, is that quality or is that something else? But because it's really all aspects of performance. When we say critical equality, we're really talking about all aspects of performance to satisfy the customer. So it's really, we are going to take all that input from the customer, whether it's related to what you traditionally might think of as quality or other aspects of performance. It can all be part of the CTQ process and the CTQ tree and customer requirements. I'm not sure that completely answered the question. So if it didn't and you were thinking something else, you can definitely let me know.
No, he's
Yeah.
our participant acknowledged that he's on board. So thanks for
Okay,
that.
good,
And
good.
at the moment, we
All
don't
right.
have any other questions.
Okay. So let me do this. I'll turn it back over to you, and you can talk
Ah,
about the next steps in terms of for our audience.